Part I. The house built to protect trust. Trust is not a feeling. It is an infrastructure. It must be built, maintained, and protected long after its origins have faded from memory. When trust collapses, it rarely does so because of a single event. It collapses because the structures designed to protect it begin to turn inward. The house associated with the heirs of Johnson & Johnson was never meant to be seen. Not in the way factories are seen, not in the way boardrooms are known, not in the way products are encountered daily. This was not a space for visibility. It was a space for insulation. The mansion was constructed to hold something fragile reputation that could not be risked in public. The family name was not simply wealthy, it was moralized. It stood for care, safety, reliability. The brand did not sell indulgence, it sold reassurance. Reassurance requires distance from conflict. Conflict undermines trust faster than failure. The house existed to keep conflict contained. From the outside, the mansion read as stability. Architecture, chosen to suggest continuity rather than dominance. No aggressive gestures, no excessive ornamentation. Nothing that would translate corporate power into personal arrogance. This restraint was deliberate. A healthcare empire cannot afford to look predatory. Its legitimacy depends on appearing careful, ethical, restrained. The private residence of its heirs had to reflect the same values, not publicly but structurally. The house was built as a protective shell, not against intrusion, against exposure. Exposure is the enemy of trust. Exposure reveals fracture, disagreement, uncertainty. In industries built on care, uncertainty is corrosive. The mansion's role was not to host. It was to absorb. Absorb tension, absorb disagreement, absorb the conflicts that could never be allowed to migrate outward into corporate narrative. What happened inside the house did not matter so long as it stayed inside. This is where the war begins. Not as scandal, as containment failure. The family that inherited Johnson & Johnson inherited more than wealth. They inherited an obligation to preserve a moral image. That obligation reshaped private life. It altered how conflict could be expressed, resolved, or even acknowledged. In families whose power is purely financial, conflict can be externalized. It can spill into courts, tabloids, or rival enterprises. In families whose power is moralized, conflict must remain invisible. Visibility is not neutral. Visibility is risk. The mansion was a risk management device. Its walls were not built to keep others out. They were built to keep narratives in. This is the central paradox of the Johnson & Johnson heirs' residence. The more trust the family controlled publicly, the less freedom they possessed privately. The house became a compression chamber for tension that could not be released elsewhere. The architecture reflects this function. Spaces are divided, not open. Movement is controlled, not fluid. Rooms are designed for separation rather than gathering. Privacy is segmented, not shared. This is not accidental. It is a spatial response to a family system that cannot afford collective rupture. Shared spaces encourage confrontation. Segmentation postpones it. Postponement is a form of control. The mansion did not resolve conflict. It delayed it. Delays accumulate interest. Over time, what was postponed began to harden. The house was not a place where trust was created. It was a place where trust was preserved at any cost. Preservation is different from renewal. Renewal requires openness. Openness invites risk. The family chose preservation. Preservation demands control. Control changes relationships. Inside the house, relationships were no longer personal first. They were strategic. Conversations were weighed. Disagreements were calculated. Silence became preferable to clarity. Silence is useful in institutions. It is corrosive in families. The mansion became a site where silence was rewarded. Not explicitly, structurally. Rooms allowed retreat rather than confrontation. Distance replaced dialogue. The house taught its occupants how to avoid rupture rather than address it. Avoidance is not neutral. It redirects energy inward. Inward energy does not disappear. It turns. What began as a structure designed to protect trust became a structure that consumed it. The war inside the mansion was not ideological. It was relational. It was not about values. It was about control over interpretation. Who speaks for the family? Who defines responsibility? Who carries blame when something goes wrong? These questions could not be answered publicly. They had to be resolved privately. But private resolution requires shared authority. Shared authority did not exist. The brand's moral weight made hierarchy unavoidable. Some voices mattered more than others. Some perspectives were protected. Others were marginalized not because they were wrong, but because they were dangerous to coherence. Coherence became the supreme value. Truth became secondary. Inside the mansion, the rules of the corporation seeped into domestic life. Risk management replaced intimacy. Image preservation replaced trust. Legal logic replaced emotional logic. This is not unique to one family. It is a pattern seen wherever private life becomes subordinate to public legitimacy. But in this house, the pattern intensified. The mansion magnified it. The larger and more insulated the space became, the easier it was to avoid resolution. Avoidance felt safer than exposure. Exposure felt existentially dangerous. Trust, once externalized as a product and a brand, could not be risked internally. This inversion is critical. The family existed to protect trust. The house existed to protect the family. But the methods overlapped. Containment worked until it didn't. Because containment requires pressure release. Without release, pressure turns into conflict. Conflict without exit becomes war. Not loud, not visible, but total. The mansion did not explode. It tightened. As years passed, the space stopped functioning as a refuge. It became a battlefield defined by silence, positioning, and inheritance anxiety. The war was not fought over money alone. It was fought over authorship. Who owns the story of care? Who defines responsibility? Who absorbs fault when moral authority fractures? These are not questions that can be answered in court or boardrooms. They require vulnerability. Vulnerability was impossible. The house had been built to prevent it. This is the dark structure beneath the scandal. Not an event. A design. A design that assumed trust could be preserved indefinitely through containment. That conflict could be managed forever if it remained unseen. The mansion was built on that assumption. The war revealed its limit. Part 2. A family that controlled care and each other. Care is never neutral when it becomes institutional. Once care is scaled, regulated, and branded, it stops being an emotion and becomes a mechanism. It acquires procedures, standards, and liabilities. It is measured, audited, defended, and when care becomes a mechanism, those who control it inherit a particular kind of power, one that does not tolerate ambiguity. The heirs of Johnson & Johnson did not simply inherit wealth. They inherited custodianship over a promise that care would remain reliable even when circumstances were not. That promise shaped the family from the inside out. Families that control luxury can afford excess. Families that control infrastructure can afford leverage. Families that control care must afford consistency. Consistency is unforgiving. It leaves little room for internal deviation. Inside such families, difference is not merely disagreement. It is risk. A risk that can ripple outward and destabilize trust that millions depend upon. This awareness changes how family members relate to one another long before any conflict becomes visible. The Johnson & Johnson heirs were bound together not by intimacy but by obligation. Obligation to maintain the appearance of alignment. Obligation to keep disagreements private. Obligation to prevent personal fracture from becoming public uncertainty. Obligation is a powerful adhesive. It holds structures together even as they strain. The mansion functioned as the physical expression of that adhesive. It did not exist to nurture closeness. It existed to manage proximity, to ensure that family members were near enough to be governed by shared rules, yet distant enough to prevent volatile confrontation. This balance between proximity and separation defined the household. The family controlled care outwardly. Inwardly, they controlled each other. Control did not manifest as overt authority. It manifested as expectation. Expectation that one would speak carefully. Expectation that one would defer when necessary. Expectation that personal needs would not supersede collective image. Expectation is more effective than command. Commands invite resistance. Expectations produce compliance without struggle. Inside the mansion, expectations were spatialized. Certain rooms were associated with authority, others with retreat. Movement through the house reinforced hierarchy without requiring explanation. Architecture did what conversation could not. It taught limits silently. In families where care is the product, emotional expression becomes a liability. Anger suggests instability. Doubt suggests unreliability. Vulnerability suggests weakness. None of these are compatible with a brand that trades on safety and assurance. As a result, emotional life becomes regulated, not suppressed. Redirected. Disagreement is not eliminated. It is displaced into indirect channels, legal language, procedural debates, questions of governance rather than feeling. Conflict is reframed as compliance issues. Emotional tension becomes strategic disagreement. This reframing is protective. It prevents raw emotion from surfacing. It also prevents resolution. Resolution requires vulnerability. Vulnerability was incompatible with the family's public role. The mansion absorbed this incompatibility. It became the site where unresolved tension could be held indefinitely, where conflict could circulate without release, where disagreements could persist without conclusion. This persistence did not produce explosion. It produced fatigue. Fatigue is corrosive. Over time, fatigue transforms care into obligation, and obligation into resentment. Resentment is quiet. It does not announce itself. It accumulates. In a family that controls care, resentment has nowhere to go. It cannot be expressed publicly. It cannot be resolved privately without risk. So it turns inward. Individuals begin to experience the family not as support but as surveillance. Every action is interpreted for its potential impact on the collective image. Every deviation is assessed for risk. Risk assessment replaces empathy. The mansion's layout reinforced this shift. Spaces designed for observation rather than communion. Corridors that allow movement without encounter. Rooms that permit withdrawal without explanation. Withdrawal becomes the default response. Default responses shape culture. A culture of withdrawal is not neutral. It isolates. Isolation breeds misinterpretation. Misinterpretation deepens mistrust. Mistrust corrodes care. The family that outwardly embodied care inwardly struggled to practice it. This inversion is structural, not moral. The demands of maintaining a healthcare empire reshaped familial interaction. Care, when scaled, demands control. Control, when internalized, reshapes relationships. The heirs did not simply inherit a business. They inherited a mode of relating, one that prioritized stability over intimacy. Inside the mansion, this mode governed daily life. Conversations were filtered. Decisions were cautious. Silences were strategic. The family did not argue openly. They negotiated positions. Positions are not feelings. They are stances. Stances can be defended. Feelings require acknowledgement. Acknowledgement invites vulnerability. Vulnerability was too risky. The house functioned as a system that rewarded restraint and punished exposure, not through explicit rules but through consequence. Those who challenged alignment found themselves marginalized. Those who complied found stability. Stability became the currency of belonging. Belonging was conditional. Conditional belonging is not belonging at all. It is probation. Probation changes behavior. Family members learn to self-regulate, to anticipate reactions, to avoid topics, to present versions of themselves that fit the collective narrative. This self-regulation was praised as maturity. In reality, it was adaptation. Adaptation has costs. It erodes authenticity. Authenticity, once eroded, is difficult to recover. The mansion did not facilitate recovery. It facilitated maintenance. Maintenance is repetitive. Repetition dulls awareness. Over time, family members forgot what unfiltered interaction felt like. They became fluent in the language of governance, and risk less so in the language of care. The irony was not lost. The family that sold care could not practice it freely, but irony was not discussed. Discussion would have required admission. Admission would have threatened coherence. Coherence was paramount. The mansion was designed to support coherence at the expense of confrontation. It allowed individuals to coexist without resolving their differences. This coexistence looked like harmony from the outside. Harmony without resolution is fragile. Fragility accumulates. As generational lines formed, tensions intensified. Younger heirs inherited not only wealth and obligation but also the accumulated residue of unspoken conflict. They entered a system already under strain. Strain was normalized. Normalization is dangerous. When strain becomes normal, its effects are underestimated. The mansion normalized strain by absorbing it quietly. No single moment signaled crisis. Everything appeared functional. Functionality is deceptive. Systems can function while deteriorating. The family continued to perform alignment. Public appearances reinforced unity. Statements emphasized shared values. The external image remained intact. Internally, alignment was increasingly performative. Performance requires energy. Energy depletes. As energy wanes, tolerance for ambiguity declines. Ambiguity had sustained the family. Once tolerance declined, positions hardened. Hardened positions turn negotiation into conflict. Conflict without release turns into war. Not a public war. A silent one. The mansion became the terrain of this war. Not because it hosted confrontation, but because it prevented escape. Family members were bound together by obligation and proximity, yet separated by mistrust and fatigue. This is the paradox of controlled care. The more tightly care is regulated, the less room there is for repair. Repair requires flexibility. Flexibility invites risk. Risk was unacceptable. The family's control over care outwardly mirrored its control inwardly. Just as the company maintained strict standards, the family enforced strict behavioral norms. Deviations were treated as errors rather than expressions. Errors are corrected. Expressions are understood. Understanding requires patience. Patience was in short supply. The mansion reflected this impatience. Its spaces favored efficiency over warmth, order over comfort, predictability over openness. Predictability is reassuring to systems. It is suffocating to relationships. As years passed, the gap between public identity and private experience widened. The family's role as guardians of care became increasingly incompatible with their capacity to care for one another. This incompatibility did not resolve itself. It intensified. The house held it together structurally. Emotionally, it fractured. The scandal did not begin with betrayal or excess. It began with misalignment. Misalignment between role and reality. Between care as a product and care as a practice. Between control as necessity and control as pathology. The mansion was built to protect trust. In doing so, it demanded control. Control extended inward. Inward control transformed relationships. Transformed relationships generated conflict. Conflict without release became war. This war did not need witnesses. It only needed time. Time enclosed within walls designed to prevent exposure did the rest. Part 1,000 architecture. Designed to suppress conflict, conflict does not always erupt. Sometimes it is absorbed. Absorption requires structure. It requires environments that can hold tension without allowing it to surface. When conflict is suppressed rather than resolved, architecture becomes more than shelter. It becomes an instrument. The mansion associated with the heirs of Johnson & Johnson was built to perform this function. It was not designed to host argument. It was designed to prevent it. This intention is visible, not in ornament but in circulation. Not in decoration but in division. The house does not invite gathering. It permits coexistence. Coexistence is not unity. It is proximity without encounter. The architecture privileges separation over convergence. Rooms are defined, enclosed, and insulated. Corridors allow movement without interaction. Staircases provide vertical escape rather than shared ascent. There is no architectural moment that compels collective presence. This is not accidental. In families where disagreement is dangerous, shared space becomes a liability. Shared space increases the likelihood of confrontation. It produces moments where silence must either be broken or become visible. The mansion avoided those moments. It allowed silence to remain private. Privacy is often mistaken for comfort. Here it was strategy. The house fragmented interaction into manageable units. One could retreat without explanation. One could avoid without appearing evasive. Movement through the space did not require acknowledgement of others. Avoidance became normalized. Normalization is powerful. When avoidance is normalized, conflict loses its stage. Without a stage, conflict does not disappear. It internalizes. Internalized conflict does not resolve. It accumulates. The mansion was designed to hold accumulation. Large houses are often associated with openness. This one was associated with containment. Containment is achieved through scale that isolates rather than connects, distance that separates rather than impresses. The house uses size to reduce density. Reduced density lowers friction. Lower friction reduces visible conflict. This reduction was essential. The family's public role could not tolerate visible fracture. Any sign of internal discord risked undermining the moral authority of a healthcare brand built on reliability and care. The house absorbed that risk. It did so by eliminating architectural triggers for confrontation. There were no central hearths that demanded gathering. No long dining tables that required prolonged face-to-face engagement. No shared thresholds that forced acknowledgement. Every design choice favored optionality. Optionality allows retreat. Retreat postpones resolution. Postponement feels safe in the short term. In the long term, it produces stagnation. The mansion institutionalized postponement. Conflict did not have to be addressed. It could be deferred indefinitely. Deferral became routine. Routine turned into habit. Habit hardened into culture. The house taught its occupants how to live with unresolved tension. Not through instruction, through experience. Experience shapes behavior more effectively than rule. Family members learned where to go to avoid others. Which rooms signaled withdrawal. Which corridors minimized encounter. The architecture became a map of avoidance. Maps guide movement. Movement defines relationship. The house defined relationships as parallel rather than intersecting. Parallel lives can coexist without collision. They can also drift without connection. Drift is quiet. Quiet drift does not attract attention. This quietness protected the family externally. Internally, it eroded trust. Trust requires exposure. Exposure was minimized. The mansion did not simply separate people physically. It separated them temporally. Different schedules, different rhythms, different routines were facilitated by the space. The house allowed asynchronous living. Asynchrony reduces overlap. Overlap increases interaction. Interaction risks confrontation. The architecture favored asynchrony. This temporal separation compounded spatial division. The family did not argue because they rarely shared time. They did not resolve because they rarely aligned. Alignment requires shared space and time. The mansion discouraged both. This discouragement was framed as privacy. Privacy is culturally valued. It suggests respect. But privacy, when used to suppress interaction, becomes isolation. Isolation alters perception. Without regular interaction, misunderstandings deepen. Assumptions replace dialogue. Assumptions harden into positions. Positions are defended. Defense replaces understanding. The architecture facilitated this progression. It allowed positions to solidify without challenge. Challenge would have required confrontation. Confrontation was architecturally inconvenient. The house made confrontation inefficient. Efficiency matters. In systems oriented toward control, inefficient actions are avoided. Confrontation is inefficient. It produces uncertainty. Uncertainty threatens coherence. The mansion prioritized coherence. Coherence required predictability. Predictability required control. Control was built into the space. The house also controlled visibility. Lines of sight were limited. Rooms did not open into one another expansively. Visual isolation complemented physical separation. Seeing others can provoke engagement. Not seeing them maintains distance. Distance feels calm. Calm feels safe. Safety discourages change. The family valued safety, not emotional safety. Reputational safety. The architecture reflected that priority. It was built to protect the family's image by preventing internal conflict from becoming visible or explosive. Explosions are memorable. Quiet erosion is not. The mansion chose erosion. Erosion is slower. It is easier to ignore. Over time, the house became a container for unresolved narratives. Each family member carried their own version of events unchallenged by shared discussion. These versions diverged. Divergence without dialogue leads to fragmentation. Fragmentation does not announce itself. It becomes apparent only when coordination fails. The mansion delayed that failure. Delay is not resolution, but it is often mistaken for it. The architecture's role was to maintain the appearance of stability. Appearance matters in moralized industries. The healthcare sector trades on assurance. Assurance requires predictability. Predictability is incompatible with visible conflict. The house eliminated visibility. It did not eliminate conflict. This distinction is crucial. The mansion was successful at what it was designed to do. It suppressed conflict. But suppression is not neutral. Suppressed conflict finds other outlets. It manifests as passive resistance, as strategic silence, as legal positioning, as inheritance disputes framed as procedural rather than emotional. The architecture did not prevent war. It changed its form. The war became procedural, cold, calculated, not shouted, documented. Meetings replaced arguments. Lawyers replaced mediators. The house normalized this shift. It made procedural conflict feel appropriate. Emotional conflict felt inappropriate. In a space designed for control, emotion appears disruptive. Disruption is avoided. Avoidance becomes policy. The family learned to fight without fighting. This form of conflict is slow. It drains energy. It corrodes relationships quietly. The mansion provided no space for catharsis. Catharsis requires shared presence and emotional release. The house offered neither. Without catharsis, tension accumulates. Accumulated tension eventually demands expression. But when architecture blocks direct expression, tension seeks indirect routes. Inheritance became a battleground. Authority became contested through interpretation rather than dialogue. Who had the right to speak? Who represented the family's values? Who could claim stewardship over trust? These questions could not be answered emotionally. They were answered structurally, through documents, through silence, through exclusion. The architecture reinforced exclusion. It made it easy to exclude without appearing hostile. Distance was normalized. Isolation was polite. Politeness masked aggression. Aggression did not look like anger. It looked like withdrawal. Withdrawal is socially acceptable. It does not raise alarms. The mansion institutionalized withdrawal. It rewarded those who retreated rather than confronted. Retreat preserved surface harmony. Surface harmony protected public image. The family prioritized image. The house reflected that priority. But image maintenance has costs. It requires constant suppression. Suppression is tiring. Over time, suppression reduces tolerance. Tolerance is necessary for coexistence. Without tolerance, even small disagreements feel intolerable. The architecture magnified this effect. Small disagreements had nowhere to go. They lingered. They festered. They accumulated meaning. Meaning that was never shared. Shared meaning requires shared space. The mansion avoided shared space. The war inside the house did not erupt because the house was built to prevent eruption. It unfolded as attrition. Attrition is slow. It is difficult to narrate. It does not produce clear villains or moments. This made it harder to address. Addressing attrition requires acknowledgement. Acknowledgement requires vulnerability. Vulnerability was incompatible with the house's function. The mansion was built to protect trust. Trust in the brand. Trust in the family's coherence. That trust demanded control. Control demanded suppression. Suppression demanded architecture. The house fulfilled its role. It suppressed conflict effectively. It also ensured that conflict could not be resolved. Resolution requires exposure. Exposure was structurally discouraged. This is the core contradiction. The architecture solved the immediate problem of visibility by creating a long-term problem of irreconcilability. Irreconcilability does not end in noise. It ends in fracture. Fracture without sound. The mansion held the family together physically while pulling them apart relationally. This is the cost of architecture designed to suppress conflict rather than host it. The war inside the house was not an accident. It was a structural outcome. The house did not cause the war. It shaped it. It turned what could have been negotiation into stalemate. Stalemate into resentment. Resentment into procedural combat. The scandal that would later be named did not begin with wrongdoing. It began with design. A design that assumed conflict could be managed indefinitely by never allowing it to surface. The mansion proved otherwise. Part IV. When moral power turns inward, moral authority is stable only when it points outward. It functions best when it is applied to markets, consumers, and abstract notions of responsibility. Once moral authority turns inward, once it is used to govern intimacy, it stops being guidance and becomes pressure. This is where the Johnson & Johnson heirs mansion crossed a threshold. Externally, the family name was synonymous with care, safety, and ethical restraint. Internally, those same values became instruments of discipline. What had once protected reputation began to regulate behavior. What had once reassured the public began to constrain the family. Moral power is different from financial power. Financial power negotiates. Moral power judges. Judgment does not tolerate ambiguity. Ambiguity is essential in family life. The mansion became the place where ambiguity was least tolerated. The family did not argue over money alone. They argued over alignment, over who embodied the values the brand claimed, over who could speak as a moral representative rather than a mere beneficiary. These disputes were not explicit. They were structural. Every disagreement carried an additional layer, not just what was being contested, but what it meant for the family's ethical image. Disagreement was never just personal. It was reputational. Reputational conflict is corrosive. It transforms ordinary differences into existential threats. Inside the mansion, moral language replaced emotional language. Instead of saying "this hurts family members," said "this is irresponsible." Instead of saying "I feel excluded," they said "this does not align with our values." Alignment became the dominant metric. Alignment is rigid. It assumes a single correct orientation. Those who deviated were not simply different. They were wrong. Wrongness invites correction. Correction invites control. The mansion facilitated this control by offering no neutral ground. There was no space where disagreement could exist without being interpreted as a failure of character or commitment. Every conversation was implicitly evaluative. Evaluation produces defensiveness. Defensiveness reduces openness. Openness is required for repair. Repair became impossible. The family's moral capital, so effective in stabilizing the brand, became a weapon internally. It allowed certain members to assert authority not through seniority or ownership, but through perceived ethical clarity. Ethical clarity is difficult to challenge. To challenge it is to appear unethical. This asymmetry distorted relationships. Power accrued not to those with the most stake, but to those who could claim the strongest alignment with institutional values. Values replaced affection as the currency of legitimacy. The mansion reinforced this shift. Its design did not support emotional reconciliation. It supported procedural correctness. Conversations felt like audits. Silence felt safer than confession. Confession could be interpreted as liability. Liability thinking entered domestic life. When liability governs intimacy, trust collapses. Trust requires the freedom to be wrong without consequence. That freedom did not exist here. The family's moral authority, once a shield, became an internal surveillance system. Members monitored not only each other but themselves. Self-censorship replaced dialogue. Self-censorship is exhausting. Exhaustion reduces tolerance. Reduced tolerance intensifies conflict. Conflict expressed through moral language is especially destructive because it offers no exit. Financial disputes can be settled. Legal disputes can be adjudicated. Moral disputes linger. They imply permanence. If someone is morally misaligned, what does reconciliation look like? The mansion provided no answer. Instead, it provided distance. Distance delayed confrontation. Delay intensified judgment. Judgment hardened positions. Positions became identities. Once identities form around moral stance, compromise feels like betrayal. The family entered this phase quietly. No public scandal marked the shift. No single incident defined it. It was a slow internal realignment where ethics replaced empathy. Empathy is flexible. Ethics, when institutionalized, is rigid. The heirs were trapped between the necessity of maintaining a moral brand and the impossibility of living ethically perfect lives. Ordinary human failures, anger, resentment, ambition became intolerable because they contradicted the image. The mansion absorbed these contradictions. It did not resolve them. It concentrated them. Moral power, when turned inward, demands consistency that humans cannot sustain. Inconsistency becomes evidence. Evidence becomes accusation. Accusation demands defense. Defense replaces dialogue. Dialogue requires trust. Trust was already compromised. The family began to interact as representatives rather than relatives. Roles replaced relationships. Decisions were justified through principle rather than care. Principle does not listen. It applies. Application is unilateral. Those subjected to it resist, but resistance cannot be explicit without appearing unethical. So resistance becomes indirect. Indirect resistance is passive-aggressive. It corrodes slowly. The mansion became the stage for this corrosion. Rooms that once symbolized refuge became zones of avoidance. Shared spaces became arenas of silent judgment. Even absence became meaningful. Absence could be read as protest. Presence could be read as compliance. Every action was interpreted. Interpretation is relentless. Relentlessness drains goodwill. Without goodwill, moral authority becomes tyranny. Not overt tyranny. A quiet one. One that claims virtue while producing alienation. The family could not escape this dynamic because their public identity depended on moral coherence. Any internal acknowledgement of ethical fracture risked external consequence. The mansion thus became a closed loop. Ethical claims generated pressure. Pressure generated conflict. Conflict could not be acknowledged. So pressure intensified. This loop had no release valve. The war inside the mansion escalated not through violence or spectacle but through exhaustion. Family members disengaged emotionally. Some withdrew entirely. Others entrenched themselves behind principle. Entrenchment feels righteous. Righteousness is isolating. Isolation deepens mistrust. Mistrust fuels further judgment. The mansion no longer protected trust. It consumed it. This is the paradox of moral power. Externally, it stabilizes systems. Internally, it destabilizes relationships. The Johnson & Johnson heirs mansion embodied this paradox. It was designed to protect a reputation built on care. In doing so, it transformed care into obligation, and obligation into coercion. Coercion does not need force. It needs justification. Ethics provided that justification. The house enforced it. What began as a structure to contain conflict became a structure that amplified it by removing all non-moral modes of resolution. There was no room for imperfection. Imperfection is human. The system rejected it. Rejection produced fracture. Fracture produced war. Not a war of actions. A war of interpretations. Who truly represented the values? Who had deviated? Who needed correction? These questions could not be answered definitively. They lingered. Lingering questions destabilize families. The mansion held those questions inside its walls, preventing them from dissipating. This containment was effective in the short term. In the long term, it ensured that the conflict would be total. When moral power turns inward, there is no neutral ground. Only alignment or exclusion. The house made exclusion easy. And in doing so, it set the stage for a legacy defined not by care but by fracture disguised as principle. Part V, the war that could never go public. Some wars are violent because violence is permitted. Others are silent because silence is mandatory. The war inside the Johnson & Johnson heirs mansion belonged to the second category not because the conflict was small but because exposure itself would have been catastrophic. What was at stake was not reputation in the ordinary sense. It was trust as infrastructure. Johnson & Johnson did not function like a luxury brand or a financial empire. Its legitimacy was built on the assumption of moral reliability. Entire systems, medical, legal, regulatory, leaned on the idea that this institution was stable even when others were not. Public conflict inside such a family would not have been read as a private matter. It would have been interpreted as institutional instability. Instability is intolerable when your product is reassurance. So, the war could not go public. That constraint reshaped everything. It reshaped how conflict could be expressed, how disagreement could be framed, how power could be exercised. The objective was not to win decisively but to endure without rupture. Survival mattered more than resolution. Control mattered more than clarity. The mansion was not simply the setting for this war. It was the technology that made it possible. It slowed time. It diluted confrontation. It converted explosive conflict into procedural attrition. This was not accidental. The architecture, routines, and culture of the house had already been optimized for containment. What PHN3 described as suppression of conflict became in PHNV a full operational doctrine war by delay. Delay was safer than decision. Decision creates records. Records create liability. Liability invites scrutiny. Scrutiny threatens trust. So decisions were postponed. Postponement was framed as caution. Silence was framed as responsibility. Absence was framed as discretion. In a moralized institution, these framings are extremely powerful. Anyone who pushed for confrontation could be reframed as reckless. Anyone who demanded transparency could be framed as destabilizing. The safest position was patience, and patience favored those least damaged by waiting. This asymmetry defined the war. Those who experienced the conflict as personal loss bled fastest. Those who experienced it as administrative inconvenience gained ground simply by staying still. The mansion enabled both experiences to coexist without collision. That coexistence was not neutral. It selected winners without ever naming them. As months turned into years, the conflict ceased to be about the original grievances. It became about endurance, about who could live longest inside ambiguity without breaking. The house normalized ambiguity. It made provisional arrangements feel permanent. Permanent provisionality is corrosive. When nothing is ever resolved, people stop expecting resolution. They adapt instead. Adaptation replaces hope. Strategy replaces sincerity. The war migrated fully into procedure. Lawyers replaced mediators. Documents replaced dialogue. Trusts, committees, and future contingencies replaced agreement. This proceduralization drained emotion from the surface while increasing the depth of the conflict underneath. What looked calm was not calm. It was frozen. Frozen systems do not heal. They fracture silently. The mansion rewarded this freezing. It allowed years to pass without forcing confrontation. No shared space demanded reckoning. No public moment required closure. Everything could remain under consideration. Under consideration became a permanent state. Inside that state, loyalty was redefined. Loyalty no longer meant care or shared history. It meant alignment with institutional survival. Anyone who prioritized personal resolution over institutional continuity was reframed as selfish, immature, or dangerous. Responsibility became the ultimate justification. Responsibility can excuse cruelty without appearing cruel. Under the banner of responsibility, exclusion could be rationalized. Silence could be enforced. Power could consolidate without announcement. All of it could be framed as necessary. Necessary for the brand. Necessary for trust. Necessary for stability. The family became secondary. The institution came first. The mansion enforced that hierarchy not through command but through exhaustion. It made emotional engagement unsustainable. Over time, people withdrew, not dramatically but incrementally. Withdrawal reduced resistance. Reduced resistance simplified governance. Simplified governance looked like restored order. Order returned. But it was hollow. The war succeeded in remaining invisible. No scandal emerged because scandal requires witnesses. No reckoning occurred because reckoning requires exposure. No resolution was demanded because nothing appeared broken. From the outside, the system worked. From the inside, it decayed. This is the nature of wars that cannot go public. They preserve institutions by consuming intimacy. They protect symbols by sacrificing relationships. They achieve structural success through human erosion. The mansion made that erosion sustainable. It absorbed conflict without reflecting it. It turned war into waiting. And waiting in this system was the most effective weapon of all. Part V. The war that could never go public. Documentary voiceover. Analytical tone. Some wars are violent because violence is permitted. Others are silent because silence is mandatory. The war inside the Johnson & Johnson heirs mansion belonged to the second category, not because the conflict was small, but because exposure itself would have been catastrophic. What was at stake was not reputation in the ordinary sense. It was trust as infrastructure. Johnson & Johnson did not function like a luxury brand or a financial empire. Its legitimacy was built on the assumption of moral reliability. Entire systems, medical, legal, regulatory, leaned on the idea that this institution was stable even when others were not. Public conflict inside such a family would not have been read as a private matter. It would have been interpreted as institutional instability. Instability is intolerable when your product is reassurance. So the war could not go public. That constraint reshaped everything. It reshaped how conflict could be expressed, how disagreement could be framed, how power could be exercised. The objective was not to win decisively, but to endure without rupture. Survival mattered more than resolution. Control mattered more than clarity. The mansion was not simply the setting for this war. It was the technology that made it possible. It slowed time. It diluted confrontation. It converted explosive conflict into procedural attrition. This was not accidental. The architecture, routines, and culture of the house had already been optimized for containment. What PHNF3 described as suppression of conflict became in PHNNV a full operational doctrine war by delay. Delay was safer than decision. Decision creates records. Records create liability. Liability invites scrutiny. Scrutiny threatens trust. So decisions were postponed. Postponement was framed as caution. Silence was framed as responsibility. Absence was framed as discretion. In a moralized institution, these framings are extremely powerful. Anyone who pushed for confrontation could be reframed as reckless. Anyone who demanded transparency could be framed as destabilizing. The safest position was patience, and patience favored those least damaged by waiting. This asymmetry defined the war. Those who experienced the conflict as personal loss bled fastest. Those who experienced it as administrative inconvenience gained ground simply by staying still. The mansion enabled both experiences to coexist without collision. That coexistence was not neutral. It selected winners without ever naming them. As months turned into years, the conflict ceased to be about the original grievances. It became about endurance, about who could live longest inside ambiguity without breaking. The house normalized ambiguity. It made provisional arrangements feel permanent. Permanent provisionality is corrosive. When nothing is ever resolved, people stop expecting resolution. They adapt instead. Adaptation replaces hope. Strategy replaces sincerity. The war migrated fully into procedure. Lawyers replaced mediators, documents replaced dialogue, trusts, committees, and future contingencies replaced agreement. This proceduralization drained emotion from the surface while increasing the depth of the conflict underneath. What looked calm was not calm, it was frozen. Frozen systems do not heal. They fracture silently. The mansion rewarded this freezing. It allowed years to pass without forcing confrontation. No shared space demanded reckoning. No public moment required closure. Everything could remain under consideration. Under consideration became a permanent state. Inside that state, loyalty was redefined. Loyalty no longer meant care or shared history. It meant alignment with institutional survival. Anyone who prioritized personal resolution over institutional continuity was reframed as selfish, immature, or dangerous. Responsibility became the ultimate justification. Responsibility can excuse cruelty without appearing cruel. Under the banner of responsibility, exclusion could be rationalized. Silence could be enforced. Power could consolidate without announcement. All of it could be framed as necessary. Necessary for the brand. Necessary for trust. Necessary for stability. The family became secondary. The institution came first. The mansion enforced that hierarchy not through command but through exhaustion. It made emotional engagement unsustainable. Over time, people withdrew not dramatically, but incrementally. Withdrawal reduced resistance. Reduced resistance simplified governance. Simplified governance looked like restored order. Order returned. But it was hollow. The war succeeded in remaining invisible. No scandal emerged because scandal requires witnesses. No reckoning occurred because reckoning requires exposure. No resolution was demanded because nothing appeared broken. From the outside, the system worked. From the inside, it decayed. This is the nature of wars that cannot go public. They preserve institutions by consuming intimacy. They protect symbols by sacrificing relationships. They achieve structural success through human erosion. The mansion made that erosion sustainable. It absorbed conflict without reflecting it. It turned war into waiting. And waiting in this system was the most effective weapon of all. Part. Via inheritance as psychological combat. Inheritance is often misunderstood as transfer. In reality, it is continuation. What moves from one generation to the next is rarely just assets. It is tension, unresolved conflict, hierarchies frozen in place, expectations shaped by silence rather than agreement. When a family survives a war that could not go public, inheritance becomes the next battlefield. This is where the conflict inside the Johnson & Johnson heirs mansion transformed. The war did not end. It changed form. Once direct confrontation had exhausted itself and silence had stabilized, the system inheritance emerged as the only remaining arena where power could still be contested. Not openly, not emotionally, but psychologically. Inheritance is uniquely suited to this role. It is both future-oriented and retrospective. It forces questions about legacy without requiring admission of past conflict. It allows power to be exercised indirectly through structure rather than action. Inside families tied to moralized institutions, inheritance carries an additional weight. It does not merely distribute wealth. It distributes authority over meaning, over who represents the values of the institution once the original custodians are gone. This made inheritance inevitable as the next phase of combat. The mansion, already functioning as an apparatus of containment, became a staging ground for anticipation. People did not fight over what had happened. They fought over what would be remembered, formalized, and authorized once memory hardened into legacy. This shift altered behavior immediately. Conflict no longer needed urgency. It required positioning. Individuals began to think less about resolution and more about survivability, about how future structures would interpret their actions, silences, and alliances. Inheritance turned time into leverage. Those who could wait benefited. Those who needed recognition lost. This dynamic had already been rehearsed during the Silent War. Inheritance simply codified it. Psychological combat differs from open conflict in one crucial way: it operates without explicit opposition. No one declares intent, no one acknowledges strategy. Every move is framed as prudence planning or responsibility. Responsibility became the dominant language. Who was responsible enough to steward the legacy? Who could be trusted to uphold the moral commitments associated with the Johnson & Johnson name? These questions were never answered directly. They were implied. Implication is powerful. It allows judgment without accusation. Inside the mansion, implication replaced argument. People read meaning into absences, delays, and procedural choices. A lack of inclusion was interpreted as assessment. A postponed decision was interpreted as evaluation. Everyone became both subject and observer. This mutual surveillance intensified psychological pressure. Family members began to internalize the conflict. They second-guessed their own motivations. They adjusted behavior not to express themselves but to anticipate how they would be interpreted by future governance structures. The war moved inside. Internalized conflict is harder to resolve because it lacks a clear opponent. One cannot negotiate with an expectation. One cannot argue with an implication. The battleground becomes the self. Inheritance sharpened this effect because it attached permanent consequences to present behavior. Every action felt archival. Every silence felt like evidence. The future was imagined as a tribunal that would retroactively judge worthiness. Worthiness replaced relationship as the central concern. This is psychologically destabilizing. When people feel constantly evaluated, they stop acting authentically. They perform. Performance becomes identity. Identity becomes brittle. Brittle identities fracture under pressure. The mansion amplified this brittleness by maintaining an environment where nothing was ever clarified. Ambiguity remained the governing condition. Ambiguity allows institutions to retain flexibility, but it is punishing for individuals. Individuals need orientation. Orientation was withheld. The inheritance structure trusts committees' contingencies was deliberately opaque. Opaqueness was framed as sophistication. Sophistication discouraged questioning. Questioning was risky. Risk-taking had already been punished during the Silent War. So people complied. Compliance does not mean agreement. It means resignation. Resignation is fertile ground for psychological conflict. It produces resentment without outlet. That resentment turns inward, manifesting as anxiety, withdrawal, or hypervigilance. The mansion housed these states quietly. From the outside, nothing appeared unusual. From the inside, inheritance felt like an ever-present test. Not a test one could pass. A test one could only avoid failing. Avoidance became strategy. Avoidance shaped relationships. Family members interacted cautiously, aware that every interaction might influence future standing. Spontaneity disappeared. Conversations became guarded. Emotional honesty was replaced by strategic neutrality. Neutrality felt safe. It was not. Neutrality prevents misunderstanding only temporarily. Over time, it deepens distance. Distance erodes trust. Without trust, inheritance becomes a zero-sum game. Zero-sum thinking entered the family slowly. No one declared it, but behavior reflected it. People began to think in terms of positioning rather than connection, of proximity to authority rather than mutual support, of visibility at the right moments rather than consistent presence. Inheritance turned family life into a long audition. Auditions are exhausting. They reward conformity. They punish deviation. The mansion's structure reinforced this dynamic by limiting opportunities for unscripted interaction. Without unscripted moments, people could not recalibrate their perceptions of one another. Misunderstandings persisted. Assumptions hardened. Inheritance thrived on these hardened assumptions. It allowed future outcomes to be justified without explicit confrontation. Decisions could be framed as natural consequences of past behavior rather than acts of exclusion. Exclusion without acknowledgement is psychologically violent. It denies the excluded party the dignity of understanding. But it is institutionally efficient. The mansion favored efficiency. As inheritance planning progressed, the psychological toll increased. Family members began to experience the house not as a shared space, but as a constant reminder of evaluation. Rooms felt charged, silences felt heavy, time felt stretched. The war was no longer between people. It was between people and anticipation. Anticipation is relentless. It offers no closure. It erodes mental resilience. Those who could detach emotionally survived better. Detachment became a virtue. Those who remained emotionally invested suffered. Investment became a liability. This inversion completed the transformation of inheritance into psychological combat. What was once a mechanism to ensure continuity became a mechanism that selected for emotional disengagement. The future belonged not to those who cared most, but to those who could care least without appearing irresponsible. The moral irony is severe. A family whose public identity was built on care found itself rewarding detachment internally. The mansion, once designed to protect trust, now rewarded emotional withdrawal as a survival strategy. Inheritance did not heal the wounds left by the silent war. It preserved them. It froze them into structure. Once frozen, they became unchallengeable. Challenge would have required reopening conflict. Reopening conflict would have threatened stability. Stability was sacred, so the psychological war continued without interruption. This is the final cruelty of inheritance as combat. It extends conflict beyond the lifespan of its participants. It ensures that unresolved tensions do not die with individuals. They are encoded into systems that persist. The mansion became a transmission device. What could not be spoken was passed on implicitly. What could not be resolved was inherited as expectation. The next generation did not inherit clarity. They inherited silence. Silence as norm. Silence as strategy. Silence as legacy. This is how wars that cannot go public ensure their continuation. They do not need active hostility. They rely on structure, on ambiguity, on psychological pressure that selects for compliance and detachment. By the time inheritance was formalized, the outcome no longer needed enforcement. Behavior had already adjusted. Relationships had already thinned. Emotional bonds had already weakened. The system held. The family did not. Inheritance achieved what confrontation never could. It stabilized power by making conflict permanent and unspoken. The mansion remained. The institution remained. The war moved forward in time, no longer needing the original participants to continue. This is inheritance as psychological combat, not a transfer of wealth. A transfer of unresolved conflict. Encoded, enduring, silent. Inheritance did not arrive as an event. It arrived as atmosphere. By the time it became explicit through documents, trusts, governance clauses, the psychological terrain had already been prepared. The family did not need to be told that inheritance would determine everything. They felt it. It was present in every pause, every deferral, every decision that was never quite finalized. Inheritance worked precisely because it was never framed as a confrontation. It was framed as inevitability. Inevitability removes agency. When outcomes feel inevitable, people stop resisting them. They adapt instead. Adaptation is quieter than resistance. It leaves no trace that can be challenged later. Inside, the mansion inheritance reshaped daily behavior long before any formal transfer occurred. Family members began to act as if they were already being evaluated by a future authority that had not yet materialized. This anticipation altered speech patterns, emotional availability, and risk tolerance. Risk tolerance collapsed. Any behavior that might later be interpreted as misalignment became dangerous. Alignment was no longer about shared values. It was about interpretive safety. People learned to choose actions that would be least likely to be questioned by unseen decision-makers. This is how inheritance becomes psychological combat. No one attacks. Everyone defends. Defense consumes attention. It narrows focus. Over time, it reduces the capacity for empathy. When individuals are locked into self-protection, they lose the ability to see others as anything other than potential threats to standing. Standing replaced belonging. Belonging had once been assumed. Now it was conditional. Conditional belonging is unstable. It produces constant, low-level anxiety. Anxiety sharpens perception but dulls compassion. The mansion became saturated with this tension. Not loud tension, ambient tension. The kind that does not announce itself but never fully dissipates. Inheritance intensified this ambience by introducing permanence. Unlike earlier phases of conflict, which could be imagined as temporary, inheritance fixed the consequences. Decisions made now would not be revisited later. Silence now would echo indefinitely. This permanence made every interaction feel weighted. Family members became archivists of their own behavior. They remembered what they had said, what they had not said, what others might remember later. Memory became strategic. Strategic memory is corrosive. It replaces shared understanding with private accounting. Private accounting is lonely. Loneliness inside a shared space is especially destabilizing. The mansion magnified this loneliness by providing physical proximity without emotional connection. People were near one another yet unreachable. Inheritance thrived in this gap. It allowed structures to replace relationships. Instead of asking one another directly, family members deferred to mechanisms. Instead of resolving tension, they allowed it to be encoded. Encoding is safer than expression. Encoded conflict does not embarrass. It does not contradict the public narrative. It simply persists. As inheritance planning advanced, the psychological load increased. The future felt crowded with implication. Every clause in a trust was read as commentary on worth. Every governance role was interpreted as validation or rejection. Validation and rejection no longer came from people. They came from systems. Systems do not explain themselves. They simply operate. This is why inheritance as combat is so effective. It removes the need for overt cruelty. No one needs to say you are excluded. Exclusion occurs through structure. Structure appears neutral. Neutrality is disarming. It makes outcomes feel deserved rather than imposed. Inside the mansion, this logic reconfigured identity. Family members began to see themselves through the lens of potential outcomes. They anticipated how they would be categorized. Responsible, unreliable, stable, risky. Once categorized, behavior followed. People began to live up or down to the roles they believed were being assigned to them. This self-fulfilling dynamic further entrenched hierarchy. Those perceived as stable became more cautious. Those perceived as unstable became more defensive. Defensiveness reinforced perception. Perception hardened into expectation. Expectation shaped inheritance. The mansion no longer needed active enforcement. The psychological system sustained itself. This is the moment when inheritance stops being a future event and becomes a present condition, a condition in which the family lives. The most damaging aspect of this condition is that it cannot be named without consequence. Naming it would require acknowledging that inheritance has already distorted relationships. Acknowledgement would threaten the legitimacy of the process. Legitimacy was non-negotiable. So, nothing was named. Silence protected the system. But silence also ensured that no one could intervene. The next generation entered this environment without context. They inherited not just wealth but an emotional climate shaped by unresolved conflict. They learned early that caution was rewarded and openness was risky. This learning did not feel oppressive. It felt normal. Normality is the most effective carrier of dysfunction. When dysfunction feels normal, it is not challenged. Inheritance thus achieved its most enduring function. It normalized psychological combat as a mode of coexistence. The mansion became a training ground. Not intentionally, structurally, it trained occupants to anticipate judgment, to minimize exposure, to prioritize system stability over personal truth. These lessons did not end with the transfer of assets. They persisted. They became habits. Habits became culture. Culture outlasted individuals. This is how inheritance ensures continuity without reconciliation. By the time legal transitions occurred, the emotional outcomes were already determined. The structures merely confirmed what behavior had already accepted. No one needed to celebrate. No one needed to protest. Everything had already settled. The war had not ended. It had been institutionalized. And institutionalized conflict does not require active participants. It reproduces itself. The mansion stood as proof. Not of success, of endurance. Endurance without repair. Repair would have required vulnerability. Vulnerability would have endangered trust. Trust once again took precedence. This is the final function of inheritance in moralized families. It preserves the appearance of continuity while ensuring that conflict never truly disappears. It moves forward, quietly, Encoded. Unresolved. Part VI. Wealth that poisoned intimacy. Wealth does not destroy intimacy by excess. It destroys it by redesigning the environment in which intimacy would otherwise survive. Inside the Johnson & Johnson heirs' mansion, intimacy did not vanish through conflict or cruelty. It disappeared because the conditions that once made closeness possible were slowly, methodically removed. What remained was a structure that functioned smoothly, without emotional connection, and therefore no longer required it. This is how intimacy is lost in systems built on permanence. Not through rupture, through optimization. The mansion optimized distance. Its scale allowed people to exist near one another without encountering one another meaningfully. Its routines normalized separation. Its culture of restraint discouraged emotional spillover. None of this was framed as loss. It was framed as maturity, discretion, professionalism. Those words matter. They are the language through which emotional absence becomes socially acceptable. Intimacy requires a suspension of consequence. It requires moments where nothing is being evaluated, archived, or interpreted for future use. Inside the mansion, such moments no longer existed. Every interaction carried weight. Every silence could later be read as intention. Every gesture felt potentially consequential. Consequence poisons intimacy. When consequence is constant, people adapt by reducing exposure. They shorten conversations. They choose safer topics. They avoid emotional disclosure. Over time, this adaptation becomes habit. Habit becomes culture. Culture becomes invisible. The family did not wake up one day to find intimacy gone. They adjusted to its absence so gradually that it stopped registering as absence at all. What would once have felt distant began to feel appropriate. Emotional neutrality became the baseline. Neutrality is stable. Stability is valued. Valued states are rarely questioned. Inside the mansion, stability was sacred. Anything that threatened it, emotion, confrontation, vulnerability, was quietly discouraged. This discouragement did not require enforcement. It was internalized. Internalization is the most effective form of control. Family members learned to manage not only what they said, but what they felt. They edited themselves preemptively. They anticipated interpretation. They calibrated tone and presence to avoid standing out. Standing out was dangerous. Danger was not physical. It was interpretive. To be misread was to risk marginalization. Marginalization inside wealthy families is rarely explicit. It occurs through reduced access, diminished influence, quieter exclusion from informal spaces where decisions take shape. These shifts are subtle enough to deny, but powerful enough to alter relationships permanently. Intimacy does not survive subtle exclusion. It requires reassurance. Reassurance requires communication. Communication was risky, so reassurance disappeared. Without reassurance, people protect themselves by lowering expectations. Lowered expectations feel like independence. Independence is praised. It is framed as strength. Strength replaced closeness as the dominant virtue. The mansion rewarded those who appeared self-sufficient. Emotional autonomy was equated with stability. Stability was equated with trustworthiness. Trustworthiness, in turn, was linked to legacy. This chain is crucial. Closeness did not disappear because people stopped caring. It disappeared because caring no longer produced advantage. In systems governed by wealth and continuity, advantage matters. Family members began to treat one another less as sources of comfort and more as variables in a larger equation. Interactions were evaluated not for emotional resonance, but for strategic implication. Was this gesture sincere or strategic? Was this absence personal or tactical? Suspicion entered where trust once lived. Suspicion does not need proof. It thrives on ambiguity. Ambiguity was everywhere. The architecture, the inheritance structures, the moral language all contributed to an environment where nothing was fully explained. In such environments, people fill gaps with fear. Fear is isolating. Isolated people do not bond. They defend. Defense replaces connection. The mansion became a defensive environment. Even moments traditionally associated with intimacy, shared meals, celebrations, transitions, were hollowed out by anticipation. Everyone was aware of what could not be said. Awareness crowded out spontaneity. Spontaneity is the soil of intimacy. Without it, relationships become formal. Formal relationships are polite, functional, and enduring. They are not intimate. The family adapted to formality. Adaptation is not acceptance. But over time the difference fades. Wealth accelerated this fading by insulating the family from external necessity. There was no shared struggle to pull people back together. No external pressure to demand cooperation. Comfort allowed fragmentation to proceed unchecked. Fragmentation did not feel violent. It felt quiet. Quiet fragmentation is rarely addressed because it does not trigger alarm. Nothing appears broken. Everything appears calm. Calm is deceptive. Calm without connection is stagnation. The mansion settled into this stagnation. Family members began to interact through roles rather than emotions. Parent, heir, steward, representative, these identities replaced relational ones. Role-based interaction is predictable. Predictability reduces anxiety. It also reduces intimacy. When people know exactly how they are expected to behave, they stop discovering one another. Discovery is essential for sustained closeness. Without discovery, relationships ossify. Wealth accelerated this ossification by freezing identities early. People were categorized stable, volatile, reliable, risky, and those categories stuck. Once categories stick, intimacy becomes difficult. Intimacy requires the freedom to change. Change is threatening in systems that prioritize continuity. Continuity mattered more than connection. The mansion existed to protect continuity. It succeeded. As intimacy declined, indifference filled the gap. Not hatred, not anger, just the absence of expectation. Family members stopped hoping for emotional responsiveness from one another. They stopped being disappointed because they stopped anticipating care. Indifference is the endpoint of poisoned intimacy. It is quieter than conflict. It is more final. Once indifference sets in, reconciliation becomes unlikely. There is nothing left to repair because nothing is perceived as broken. Distance feels normal. Emotional absence feels appropriate. The family continued to function. Roles were fulfilled. Appearances were maintained. The institution remained intact. But intimacy had exited the system entirely. This is the quiet cost of wealth when it becomes the primary organizing force of life. It does not need to corrupt values explicitly. It only needs to make closeness inefficient. The mansion accomplished this by offering security without warmth, presence without availability, comfort without connection. Over time, these substitutions became sufficient. By the time anyone recognized what had been lost, the environment no longer supported its return. Intimacy cannot be restored by decision or policy. It requires a context in which vulnerability is safe. Safety had been redefined too thoroughly. The family remained. The structure remained. But the ability to be close to risk being seen without consequence had been trained out of the system. This is how wealth poisons intimacy. Not by excess. By design. Part VEI, the mansion as a closed system. A house becomes dangerous when it stops interacting with the world around it. Not because it is hidden, but because it no longer adjusts. Adjustment requires feedback. Feedback requires exposure. Exposure was the one thing the Johnson & Johnson heirs mansion was built to avoid. Over time, this avoidance transformed the house from a protective enclosure into a closed system. Closed systems behave differently. They recycle their own logic. They amplify internal signals. They resist correction. What begins as stability slowly turns into rigidity, and rigidity, when left unchallenged, produces fracture. The mansion reached this stage quietly. There was no moment of declaration, no architectural change, no formal shift in purpose. The transformation occurred through use, through repetition, through the gradual withdrawal of anything that could introduce unpredictability. Unpredictability is destabilizing. Destabilization was unacceptable. So the house sealed itself. This sealing was not physical. It was relational. The mansion stopped functioning as a permeable environment. Outside perspectives were filtered. External pressures were absorbed, but not allowed to alter internal dynamics. The family interacted primarily with itself, through itself, and about itself. This inward turn intensified everything. Without external reference points, internal assumptions hardened. Interpretations went unchallenged. Narratives reinforced themselves. Small dynamics took on disproportionate importance. In open systems, friction is distributed. In closed systems, friction accumulates. The mansion accumulated friction. Every unresolved conflict from earlier phases, suppressed confrontation, moralized power, psychological inheritance, poisoned intimacy, remained active inside the system. None of these tensions dissipated. They circulated, Circulation without release creates pressure. Pressure changes behavior. Family members began to orient themselves not toward resolution or connection but toward survivability within the system. They learned what could be said and what could not, what behaviors were tolerated and which were quietly penalized. Over time, these lessons became instinctive. Instinctive behavior does not feel oppressive. It feels normal. Normality is the most effective form of enclosure. Once enclosure feels normal, escape becomes unthinkable. The mansion did not trap people physically. It trained them psychologically. Leaving did not promise relief. Distance did not guarantee freedom. The system had already been internalized. Even absence was shaped by the same logic of anticipation and interpretation. This is what makes closed systems so resilient. They do not rely on walls. They rely on habits. Habits are portable. The mansion functioned as a closed system, not because it was isolated from the world, but because it no longer needed the world to validate itself. Its internal logic had become self-sustaining. Trust was preserved externally. Control was preserved internally. No contradiction was acknowledged. Inside the house, repetition replaced renewal. Routines repeated. Conversations circled familiar ground. Decisions followed established patterns. Nothing new entered the system unless it could be absorbed without disruption. Disruption was filtered out. Filtered environments feel calm. Calm was interpreted as success. But calm without permeability is stagnation. Stagnation does not announce itself. It manifests as sameness. Days blurred, years passed, roles remained fixed, expectations hardened. The mansion continued to operate smoothly, but it no longer evolved. Evolution requires error. Error requires tolerance. Tolerance had been sacrificed to protect trust. The house could not tolerate error. Mistakes were not processed. They were archived. Archived mistakes do not disappear. They wait. Over time, the archive grew heavier. Family members carried the weight of unaddressed moments, things said too cautiously, things never said at all, decisions deferred beyond relevance. The closed system ensured these moments were never revisited openly. Revisiting would have required disruption. Disruption was incompatible with the system's goal, so everything stayed inside. Inside became crowded, not with people, with meaning. Meaning without expression becomes distortion. Distortion reshapes perception. Family members began to interpret neutral events through the lens of accumulated tension. A delay was no longer just a delay. It was intention. An absence was no longer coincidence. It was message. Closed systems encourage overinterpretation. Without external calibration, nothing feels accidental. This heightened sensitivity increased anxiety. Anxiety further reduced openness. Openness was already risky. Now it was unbearable. The mansion thus completed its transformation from home to enclosure. Not an enclosure that confined bodies, but one that constrained possibility. Possibility is essential for psychological health. Without it, people shrink. They limit themselves to what feels safe. Safety in this system meant predictability. Predictability required conformity. Conformity produced stability. Stability justified the system. The system validated itself. From the outside, the mansion appeared unchanged. It remained impressive, orderly, respectable. It continued to symbolize continuity and discretion. Symbols are persuasive. They conceal process. The process inside the house was no longer aligned with the image it projected. But alignment was not required. The system was self-referential now. This self-reference made intervention impossible. No external authority could challenge internal logic without being framed as threat. No internal actor could challenge it without risking marginalization. The system protected itself by making challenge illegible. Illegible challenges are ignored. Ignored challenges fade. What remained was a stable enclosure, stable but fragile. Closed systems are fragile precisely because they appear strong. They resist change until change becomes unavoidable. When correction finally arrives, it arrives violently or not at all. The mansion avoided violent correction by absorbing everything. Absorption is not healing. It is accumulation. Accumulation has limits. By the time the house reached those limits, the people inside it had already adapted too deeply to imagine alternatives. They no longer expected transformation. They expected continuation. Continuation without vitality. The mansion no longer needed to impose rules. The rules lived inside its occupants. They carried the system forward, even beyond the house. This is the final function of a closed system. It reproduces itself, not through force. Through normalization, the Johnson & Johnson heirs mansion did not collapse. It succeeded. It preserved trust. It maintained control. It ensured continuity. But in doing so, it eliminated permeability, adaptability, and repair. It became a system that could not learn, only persist. Persistence is not the same as health. Health requires exchange. Exchange requires openness. Openness was sacrificed long ago. What remained was a structure that could endure indefinitely, even as the human capacity to live fully inside it diminished. The house stood, the system held, and the people inside learned how to survive without expecting anything more. Part VEI: the mansion as a closed system. A house becomes dangerous when it stops interacting with the world around it. Not because it is hidden, but because it no longer adjusts. Adjustment requires feedback. Feedback requires exposure. Exposure was the one thing the Johnson & Johnson heirs mansion was built to avoid. Over time, this avoidance transformed the house from a protective enclosure into a closed system. Closed systems behave differently. They recycle their own logic. They amplify internal signals. They resist correction. What begins as stability slowly turns into rigidity. And rigidity, when left unchallenged, produces fracture. The mansion reached this stage quietly. There was no moment of declaration. No architectural change, no formal shift in purpose. The transformation occurred through use, through repetition, through the gradual withdrawal of anything that could introduce unpredictability. Unpredictability is destabilizing. Destabilization was unacceptable. So the house sealed itself. This sealing was not physical. It was relational. The mansion stopped functioning as a permeable environment. Outside perspectives were filtered. External pressures were absorbed but not allowed to alter internal dynamics. The family interacted primarily with itself, through itself, and about itself. This inward turn intensified everything. Without external reference points, internal assumptions hardened, interpretations went unchallenged, narratives reinforced themselves. Small dynamics took on disproportionate importance. In open systems, friction is distributed. In closed systems, friction accumulates. The mansion accumulated friction. Every unresolved conflict from earlier phases, suppressed confrontation, moralized power, psychological inheritance, poisoned intimacy, remained active inside the system. None of these tensions dissipated. They circulated. Circulation without release creates pressure. Pressure changes behavior. Family members began to orient themselves not toward resolution or connection, but toward survivability within the system. They learned what could be said and what could not. What behaviors were tolerated and which were quietly penalized. Over time, these lessons became instinctive. Instinctive behavior does not feel oppressive. It feels normal. Normality is the most effective form of enclosure. Once enclosure feels normal, escape becomes unthinkable. The mansion did not trap people physically. It trained them psychologically. Leaving did not promise relief. Distance did not guarantee freedom. The system had already been internalized. Even absence was shaped by the same logic of anticipation and interpretation. This is what makes closed systems so resilient. They do not rely on walls. They rely on habits. Habits are portable. The mansion functioned as a closed system, not because it was isolated from the world, but because it no longer needed the world to validate itself. Its internal logic had become self-sustaining. Trust was preserved externally. Control was preserved internally. No contradiction was acknowledged. Inside the house, repetition replaced renewal. Routines repeated. Conversations circled familiar ground. Decisions followed established patterns. Nothing new entered the system unless it could be absorbed without disruption. Disruption was filtered out. Filtered environments feel calm. Calm was interpreted as success. But calm without permeability is stagnation. Stagnation does not announce itself. It manifests as sameness. Days blurred, years passed, roles remained fixed, expectations hardened. The mansion continued to operate smoothly, but it no longer evolved. Evolution requires error. Error requires tolerance. Tolerance had been sacrificed to protect trust. The house could not tolerate error. Mistakes were not processed. They were archived. Archived mistakes do not disappear. They wait. Over time, the archive grew heavier. Family members carried the weight of unaddressed moments, things said too cautiously, things never said at all, decisions deferred beyond relevance. The closed system ensured these moments were never revisited openly. Revisiting would have required disruption. Disruption was incompatible with the system's goal. So everything stayed inside. Inside became crowded. Not with people, with meaning. Meaning without expression becomes distortion. Distortion reshapes perception. Family members began to interpret neutral events through the lens of accumulated tension. A delay was no longer just a delay, it was intention. An absence was no longer coincidence, it was message. Closed systems encourage overinterpretation. Without external calibration, nothing feels accidental. This heightened sensitivity increased anxiety. Anxiety further reduced openness. Openness was already risky. Now it was unbearable. The mansion thus completed its transformation from home to enclosure. Not an enclosure that confined bodies, but one that constrained possibility. Possibility is essential for psychological health. Without it, people shrink. They limit themselves to what feels safe. Safety in this system meant predictability. Predictability required conformity. Conformity produced stability. Stability justified the system. The system validated itself. From the outside, the mansion appeared unchanged. It remained impressive, orderly, respectable. It continued to symbolize continuity and discretion. Symbols are persuasive. They conceal process. The process inside the house was no longer aligned with the image it projected, but alignment was not required. The system was self-referential now. This self-reference made intervention impossible. No external authority could challenge internal logic without being framed as threat. No internal actor could challenge it without risking marginalization. The system protected itself by making challenge illegible. Illegible challenges are ignored. Ignored challenges fade. What remained was a stable enclosure. Stable but fragile. Closed systems are fragile precisely because they appear strong. They resist change until change becomes unavoidable. When correction finally arrives, it arrives violently or not at all. The mansion avoided violent correction by absorbing everything. Absorption is not healing. It is accumulation. Accumulation has limits. By the time the house reached those limits, the people inside it had already adapted too deeply to imagine alternatives. They no longer expected transformation. They expected continuation. Continuation without vitality. The mansion no longer needed to impose rules. The rules lived inside its occupants. They carried the system forward, even beyond the house. This is the final function of a closed system. It reproduces itself. Not through force, through normalization. The Johnson & Johnson heirs mansion did not collapse. It succeeded. It preserved trust. It maintained control. It ensured continuity. But in doing so, it eliminated permeability, adaptability, and repair. It became a system that could not learn, only persist. Persistence is not the same as health. Health requires exchange. Exchange requires openness. Openness was sacrificed long ago. What remained was a structure that could endure indefinitely, even as the human capacity to live fully inside it diminished. The house stood. The system held, and the people inside learned how to survive without expecting anything more. Part IX Legacy, without alignment. There is a moment when a life stops being the primary site of meaning. Not because the person disappears, but because the structures surrounding that life begin to operate independently of it. At that point, experience loses authority. Interpretation takes over. Meaning migrates from what was lived to what can be stabilized. This is the beginning of legacy. Legacy does not form when a person plans it. It forms when revision becomes impossible. By the time the Johnson & Johnson heirs mansion entered, this phase alignment had already dissolved. Alignment between inner life and outer narrative. Between intention and outcome. Between what was endured privately and what would later be remembered publicly. The house was central to this separation. It provided a fixed object around which meaning could settle once people no longer could. Fixed structures attract interpretation because they endure. Endurance invites explanation. People assume that what lasts must signify something coherent. The mansion lasted. The human relationships that animated it did not. This inversion is decisive. Legacy is often imagined as a continuation of self. In reality, it is a replacement. Once individuals can no longer actively shape meaning systems, step in to stabilize it. Institutions, brands, and cultural memory require clarity. Clarity is achieved through simplification. Simplification does not consult lived experience. It selects what is legible. The mansion was legible. It was visible, durable, photographable. It communicated stability without context. It could be pointed to, described, and integrated into narratives that favored outcome over process. The interior life that unfolded inside it did not share these qualities. It could not be displayed. It could not be preserved. It could not be summarized without distortion. So it receded. Legacy forms where complexity withdraws. The house became a proxy for the life. This proxy relationship is rarely questioned because it is efficient. It allows stories to be told without confronting ambiguity. It allows admiration without responsibility. It allows institutions to present closure where none existed. The legacy that formed around the mansion did not reflect alignment. It reflected substitution. The structure substituted for experience. The name substituted for relationship. The symbol substituted for interior reality. This substitution was not malicious. It was structural. Systems prefer stability. Alignment is dynamic. Dynamic elements are difficult to preserve, so they are removed. What remains is not false. It is incomplete. The mansion, now detached from the lived tensions it once contained, became an interpretive surface. Visitors, historians, and institutions projected meaning onto it. These projections were shaped less by the family's private experience and more by cultural expectations. Expectations about responsibility, about continuity, about moral stewardship. The house became evidence of these values even when the life inside it had been shaped by their absence. Legacy prefers causality. Alignment requires sequence. Sequence complicates causality, so sequence disappears. The house becomes an endpoint. Endpoints do not require explanation. They require admiration. Admiration is emotionally economical. It allows engagement without discomfort. Discomfort would require acknowledging misalignment between success and satisfaction, between continuity and cost. Legacy avoids that. Legacy stabilizes. Stabilization is not neutral. It selects what can be remembered. The Johnson & Johnson name was remembered. The internal erosion was not. The mansion facilitated this selection by offering a stable anchor for memory. Memory gravitates toward objects that endure. Endurance feels trustworthy. But endurance can be misleading. What endures is not always what mattered most. It is often what was easiest to preserve. The house was preserved. The tension was not. This is where alignment fully dissolves. The legacy that solidified around the mansion aligned with institutional needs, not human experience. It supported narratives of care, continuity, and reliability without acknowledging the private cost of maintaining those narratives. The house did not contradict the legacy. It enabled it. Not because it confirmed it, but because it did not resist it. The mansion could not speak. It could not correct. It could not complicate. Silence was interpreted as agreement. The absence of visible conflict was taken as resolution. The legacy stabilized. At this stage, even critique became difficult. Critique would require reintroducing ambiguity. Ambiguity threatens coherence. Coherence is protected. The mansion became a closed sign. Its meaning felt settled. The house was no longer a question. It was an answer. Answers do not invite inquiry. They end it. This is the final stage of legacy formation. When structures outlive agency, meaning becomes fixed. Fixity is seductive. It promises certainty. But certainty achieved through substitution is fragile. It depends on continued distance from lived complexity. As long as that distance remains, the legacy holds. The mansion continued to stand as proof of something that no longer required examination. The institution continued to trade on trust that no longer needed to be interrogated. The system no longer needed the people who had sustained it. This is legacy without alignment. Not false, but detached. The life that preceded it did not disappear. It was overwritten. What remained was a stable narrative ecosystem that no longer needed lived experience to justify itself. The mansion no longer contained a life. It contained a story. That story could be taught, repeated, believed. Whether it aligned with the experience it replaced became irrelevant. Alignment was no longer required. Only endurance. And endurance the house provided. Part X. What remains when nothing needs to change? At the end of systems like this, there is no collapse. There is continuation. Continuation is often mistaken for success because it produces no visible disruption. Buildings remain standing. Institutions remain functional. Names retain their authority. From the outside, nothing appears unresolved. But resolution is not the same as endurance. Endurance is simply what remains when correction is no longer possible. The Johnson & Johnson heirs mansion does not stand as a monument to failure. It stands as evidence of a system that learned how to persist without repair. Everything inside it adjusted just enough to prevent rupture, but never enough to allow transformation. This is not an accident. It is the predictable outcome of structures designed to protect trust at all costs. When trust becomes infrastructure rather than relationship, it stops responding to lived experience. It becomes something that must be maintained rather than questioned. Maintenance replaces reflection. Reflection introduces risk. Risk was eliminated long ago. By the time the story reaches its end, there is no one left who expects change. Expectation requires imagination. Imagination requires the belief that things could be otherwise. That belief has been trained out of the system. The mansion no longer needs enforcement. It no longer needs secrecy. It no longer needs even the people who once animated it. Its logic has been fully internalized and externalized at the same time. Internalized in behavior. Externalized in legacy. This is the quiet power of closed systems. They do not ask for loyalty. They produce compliance. Compliance is more durable than loyalty because it does not depend on belief. It depends on habit. Habit carries systems forward long after their original purpose has faded. The house persists because it does not need to justify itself. It exists as a stable object in a world that prefers stability over accuracy. Its presence reassures. Its silence suggests resolution. Silence is persuasive. It implies that nothing remains to be said. But what remains unsaid does not disappear. It is simply removed from consideration. The human cost of this system, suppressed conflict, moralized control, psychological inheritance, intimacy made inefficient, does not vanish. It is absorbed, redistributed, and forgotten. Forgotten not because it lacked importance, but because it lacked visibility. Visibility was never allowed. This is why the ending does not feel like an ending. There is no final act, no reckoning, no revelation. The system did not fail. It succeeded. It preserved continuity. It protected trust. It ensured endurance. And in doing so, it demonstrated the quiet trade that defines institutions built on moral authority. They can survive indefinitely by making human experience irrelevant to their operation. The mansion stands as proof, not of what was lived inside it, but of what outlived those lives. Legacy remains. Alignment does not. What is remembered is not the tension, the silence, or the erosion. What is remembered is the structure that endured. The structure becomes the story. Stories that do not change do not invite reconsideration. They invite belief. Belief closes inquiry. This is where the narrative settles. Not in tragedy. Not in triumph. In permanence. The most unsettling aspect of this ending is not what happened. It is what did not have to happen for the system to continue. No one needed to be exposed. No one needed to be punished. No one needed to admit error. Everything simply moved forward. This is the final lesson embedded in the house. That systems designed to protect trust can do so by severing it from human experience. That stability can be achieved without understanding. That endurance can replace truth. And that once this substitution is complete, nothing within the system feels broken enough to demand change. The mansion remains. The name remains. The story remains. What does not remain is the capacity for correction. And when correction disappears, what follows is not collapse. It is silence.